still a hope I'll soon be resting home. Might be change a-comin'. I meet Magpie Mogo by Master Mitchell Masker's mausoleum. Shit still tended by Institute of Surveyors New South Wales Division. What a fucking pioneer of terra nullius. Of land mob be intimate with each grain of sand. Use mob to survey what him couldn't and kill them when him wouldn't. True, he warbles. He says, that there delicious entropy craftin', masterpiece of planet and hopo sapiens, another dark ages of own making, stepping up for audition, just for yous, creatures of extinction, while monarchs take standing ovations, a moment's silence, please, for 2 centuries of oppression. At twilight, I check Wombhole, and she, augury, be gone. A feathered and oracled universe, now far away, crying out in elemental labour, heavy breathing, heat and life into new black and white falla. Hear her cackling song. That was fucking interesting. Thank you.
So we have to do a massive shout out to our poetry editor Toby Fitch, who just has like amazing taste, as you can tell. Panda and Yeena, thank you so much. That's gorgeous, and a really beautiful way of introducing everybody to issue 250, which, as you can tell, we're incredibly proud of, as we should be. We're going to have a brief intermission of about 15 minutes, and then we're kind of going to regather and we're going to talk about the archive when we come back. So please grab another drink, grab something to eat, and join us back here in about 15 minutes. Dingiwala, hello again. We are going to kick off the next stage, Overland 250 Archive, Too Fast, Too Furious, with some videos. The first video is very, very excitingly from Lily Brett, who has recorded this all the way from New York. And this is, obviously it's pretty exciting. She'll be reading from her short story Miriam, which was published in 1988 in our 110th edition, which is actually at the back there if you would like to have a look at that. And then after that, we'll be hearing from Jordana Silverstein, who has written an archival response to Lily's short story. So please enjoy.
This is part of a short story called Miriam. I wrote this decades ago. Garth's new trousers had 3 pleats on either side of the zip. Until now, he had worn skin-tight, peg-legged Levi's. Miriam looked at Garth. She found the loose space between his legs alluring. She started to think about what lay behind these parallel pleats. Not since Miriam was 17 had she felt lustful just looking at a man's crotch. Out of bed, Miriam rarely felt sexually aroused. She had enough trouble feeling that way in bed. Where were the children? Could they hear? Was she ovulating? Should she use Ultrasure with spermicidal cream or Nuda, natural feeling condoms? What was the time? Did she have to get up early in the morning? These were questions that occupied Miriam when sex seemed imminent. A distant memory flickered in Miriam's head. She quickly tried to calculate how old she would have been in the 1950s, when all men wore pleats in their pants. She had been still young enough to sit on her father's lap and crush him with hugs when he came home from work. Miriam had always adored her father. She still did. She couldn't resist his generosity and his sense of humour. She loved the way that he turned beetroot red and cried when he laughed. If he laughed at the dinner table, pieces of fish or chicken would fly from his mouth and land on the other side of the kitchen. Miriam's girlfriends also adored her father. Mr. Bloom, can you drive us to Luna Park? They would beseech him. On Saturdays and Sundays, Mr. Bloom could be seen driving through the streets of Melbourne, his pink Pontiac Parisienne full of chattering, gum-chewing 14-year-olds. If they passed Leo's Spaghetti Bar in Fitzroy Street, the girls knew that they could rely on Mr. Bloom to shout them to a round of chocolate gelati. Mr. Bloom loved gelati. Before the war in Lodz, Poland, Mr. Bloom used to spend more money a week on ice cream than most people earned. Mr. Bloom came from one of the wealthiest Jewish families in Lodz. They owned apartment blocks, knitting mills and a timber yard. Mr. Bloom, at 16, was in charge of the timber yard. He doubled the turnover, fiddled the books and pocketed the profit. Nobody noticed. Mr. Bloom met Mrs. Bloom when she was the very quiet, studious, extraordinarily beautiful Basha Rodham. Mr. and Mrs. Rodham, pious, hard-working, respected members of the Jewish community, lived in 2 small rooms with their 7 children. Mrs. Rodham paid the caretaker of their block a couple of zlotys extra a week to keep one of the external toilets solely for the use of the Rodham family. Basha was always grateful for this luxury. Green-eyed Basha's ambition was to study medicine. She was not easily deterred from her studies. Mr. Bloom wooed this red-haired, slim-hipped, serious 16-year-old fervently. He bought her the first pineapple she had ever seen, and peaches and strawberries. Just as Basha finished high school and was preparing to leave for the University of Brussels, Germany invaded Poland. All Jews living in Lodz were ordered to move to a slum area of the city. In this ghetto, they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Mr. and Mrs. Rodham urged Basha to marry Mr. Bloom. They thought that she would be better off with his family. In their haste and confusion, the Bloom family had only been able to pack a few valuables. At the end of that first year in the ghetto, they were as poor and as hungry as everyone else. They had sold their last diamond, a blue-white 2.4 carat stone in heavy 18 carat gold setting, for a sack of potato peels. Potato peels were a luxury in the ghetto. You had to have good connections in the public kitchens to buy this delicacy. You also had to know whether the kitchen used knives or potato peelers. Peels from the kitchen that used potato peelers were mostly just thin films of dirt. Miriam hated hearing about the potato peels. It somehow seemed worse than the stories about children dying in the streets and relatives killing each other for a piece of bread, and trainload after trainload of people being shipped out of the ghetto, never to be heard of again. When Miriam was 12, she had boiled herself a pot of potato peels. She had often wondered what they tasted like. She was halfway through her first mouthful when Mrs. Bloom came home unexpectedly. Mrs. Bloom, who had never laid a hand on Miriam, took the bowl of potato peels, and screaming and crying, she shook Miriam by the hair until Miriam fainted. The thought of her father's penis made Miriam feel nauseous. If she thought about her father in sexual terms, she would have to think about him fucking her mother. She tried to blink that thought out of her head. Miriam used to be able to think thoughts out of her head. She would grit her teeth and blink hard 3 times, and the thought would disappear. Now, 3 years into an analysis, Miriam knew there was no magic in blinking. At 17, Miriam was having furtive sex regularly, if erratically, with her first serious boyfriend. One evening, with her puce-faced boyfriend hovering above her, Miriam was suddenly seized with the thought that maybe her parents were doing the same thing in their bedroom across the hallway. Her stomach heaved and she vomited and vomited. Fortunately, Miriam's boyfriend considered himself an existential eccentric. He felt that this messy, smelly, potentially humiliating episode merely added to the interesting experiences of his life. Melbourne is a small city. Years later, people still asked Miriam if it was true that she had chucked all over Johnny Rosenberg while he was fucking her. Garth looked like Mr. Bloom. He was pale-skinned and dark-haired with heavy-lidded large brown eyes. Garth, Miriam's second non-Jewish husband, at least looked Jewish. Miriam saw this as progress. Frank, her first husband, was 6'2" tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes, a perfect Aryan prototype. At 19, Miriam had ended her adolescent rebellion with a bang by marrying Frank. Australian men Mrs. Bloom had told Miriam regularly, "Go to the pub every day after work. They don't come home until after the children are in bed. When they come home, they are not interested in what they eat. Probably they've eaten a pie in the pub." What sort of life would that be for you, Miriam? And then when it comes to the private things of life, an Australian husband will handle you very badly. They won't touch you gently. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me by video tonight. I start, of course, by acknowledging that I'm reading to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And that fact is central to my writing and my work, and the way I live my life on this land. Thanks so much, Overland and Evelyn, for asking me to contribute this piece, and yeah, it was a real honour and delight. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the piece called Bodies, Lives Intertwined. So Jewish bodies are not simple things. Early Zionists actively wanted to reform the Jewish body to make it hard and fast and strong and lean, not rounded, soft, gentle, tender, to make it heterosexual, masculine, aggressive. In this vision, Jewish bodies were meant to take up space through strength and exertion, but to be neatly contained in how they were built. These ideas continue. They remain in how Zionism is lived in the everyday, with a conscription army inside the state of Israel, and the mass use of security guards and the paraphernalia of security culture among Jewish Zionist communities in Australia. We see it every day. We see it too in Zionist youth movements and in the social demands on Jews to marry other Jews and have Jewish babies. When I was in Palestine in 2007, doing research on cultures of Holocaust memory, which is a trip I wouldn't do now because of BDS, but I stayed with a high school friend who had moved to Israel. It was scorching hot, and I was sweaty and hairy and unkempt, while she was lean with short, straight hair, everything in its place, no sign of sweat ever. It was stark and fascinating. Lily Brett's depiction of bodies, sex, food, neuroses, relationships and Holocaust memory was published in 1988, the year of the bicentenary of Australia. And so it, in some ways, sits as part of that moment in time. Or maybe to put it better, I want to think about it in terms of that moment. Invited into the vast archives of Overland's past, I went straight to the 1988 editions to think in some ways about nation building, about how Overland might have been thinking about this moment in its time. I love that this piece might be part of that time, not because the nation should be built, it shouldn't, Australia must end, but because this is something other, and I want stories like this that tell of the location in place, but which do not try to build the nation in my collective past. There is an invitation there to reflect on past relationships I've been in with the non-Jews and the Jews, the textures of the bodies and the love that has flown between us, the passions and the hurt, the ambiguities and the incredible neuroses. Garth's new trousers had 3 pleats on either side of the zip. Until now, he had worn skin-tight, peg-legged Levi's. Miriam looked at Garth. She found the loose space between his legs alluring. She started to think about what lay behind those parallel pleats. I went for a walk along Merry Creek during the long lockdown in 2021, shortly after my boyfriend and I had broken up, with a friend who has 3 kids, 2 cats and a husband. And she told me how she constantly had someone touching her. I spoke of how I never got to touch or be touched by another person. I now tell this story sometimes as a funny moment to illustrate the vastly different experiences of lockdown. I don't know that it really is funny, but I know skin hungers. Garth stood next to Miriam. He wound his leg around her leg and stroked her face. All 3 children were at school. They lay down and had a noisy fuck. After she came, Miriam wept and wept. She often cried after a strong orgasm. She knew that it usually meant that she'd been shutting herself off from any intense emotions, been out of touch with her sadness. Shortly after my breakup, I got a pair of shoes fixed by the cobbler on Nicholson Street. I waited while she polished my shoes, and there was something in the care with which she buffed the rounded heels that made me burst into tears. I was being looked after by hands that take care and want the best. She was kind. We joked together about the awkward emotions of breakups. The whole body can be taken over by these moments. They are not solely of the mind and the heart, but my stomach, with its very Jewish IBS curses, felt these emotions deeply. There were so many levels and layers to the strangeness of those times. My Jewishness and my Jewish body has been an issue in some relationships, but not all. My body can do some things, but not others. At times I've cursed my body for what I think it can't do. I don't always give it credit for what it can do. When I started living by myself 6 years ago now, I started baking a lot more, and with lockdowns that increased. Cakes could be easily transported and shared. Every Shabbos dinner, I take cake to my parents' place. My mum talks about how I'm good at baking like my grandmother was. I make mostly butter cakes, apple cakes, cheesecakes, lemon cakes. Simple and warming, rounded. In that last part of 2021, that same friend took me to an outdoor exercise group. Illustrate the vastly different experiences of lockdown. I don't know that it really is funny, but I know Creek during the long lockdown in 2021, shortly after my boyfriend and I had broken up, with a friend who has 3 kids, 2 cats, felt these emotions deeply. There were so many levels and layers to the strangeness of those times. My Jewishness and my Jewish body has been an issue in some relationships, but not all. My body can do some things, but not others. At times I've cursed my body for what I think it can't do. I don't always give it credit for what it can do. When I started living by myself 6 years ago now, I started baking a lot more, and with lockdowns that increased. Cakes could be easily transported and shared. Every Shabbos dinner, I take cake to my parents' place. My mum talks about how I'm good at baking like my grandmother was. I make mostly butter cakes, apple cakes, cheesecakes, lemon cakes. Simple and warming, rounded. In that last part of 2021, that same friend took me to an outdoor exercise group. I had had to break up with my therapist, who had helped me in some ways, but who had become inappropriate, and exercise would keep my brain moving. I've kept going, both in the gym, which my boyfriend introduced me to, and with the group, and I now have muscles and can do sit-ups. My body remains pleasingly soft, but has grown a firmness. But I'm resolute that this is not a Zionist strength. It's to make me more at home in my body, and with what it can do in the world and in relationships. When it winds with other bodies, it feels different now. I still have some way to go, but I am more in my body. My body is sturdy. I hope it can fight. I sat recently in a meeting with someone objectionable and pondered how in different circumstances I would fight them. Physically, I thought about punching them in the neck. But civility prevents such things happening. We have agreed on rules for what bodies can do in particular places. We agree to some of these rules without even knowing it. Such is the bodily discourse. Bodies are a relationship. They contain stories and ideas and histories, some of which we make and some of which we are made by, in a circular, never-ending movement. Sometimes it makes me weep a little, thinking about this little body of mine in space, all the conversations and moments it has been part of. That tram to work that takes me past my grandparents' places also takes me past what I've come to term Ex's Row, a short span of streets where 3 of my exes lived. Stories are overlayered. Nothing is only one thing. The roundness of life comes for us all, maybe.
So I would love to encourage you to read the full version of Jordana's essay in our 250th edition, and also to peruse the digital collections online for Overland's complete 69 years of publishing history, in which you can find Lily Brett's work and the work of many others. I just want to make a note to also acknowledge that Jordana has actually just published an incredibly exciting book, and I think by just published I mean within like this month, and I am getting the title for you now. It is called Cruel Care, A History of Children at Our Borders. It's with Monash University Publishing, and it is, I think, available quite widely, so please go and purchase that book and support Jordana's work. We were really excited to have her be the first piece for this series, which also includes the work of Janine Lane, Samuel Ryan, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later, Jeff Sparrow, who you'll also be hearing from very soon, and Nayuka Gorrie. Now, Nayuka was actually going to be reading this piece themselves this evening, but unfortunately they are the parent of 2 little babies who are unwell this evening, I believe. So we are sending our love to Nayuka, Yuri, and Wani? Wani's the other one, yeah, Wani. And we hope that they will recover well soon. But I have been given the immense privilege of being able to read from Nayuka's work. Nayuka has chosen to respond to an essay that was written by Warrigal Anderson in a 1996 edition of Overland. And I have it right here. I'd actually like to read a little bit from the piece for you, if that is okay. Now, I don't have an up-to-date bio of Warrigal Anderson. I do know that he had a book that was published in 1996 with the University of Queensland Press. He was a winner of the David Yeena Prize. And that the book is called, I don't believe it's still in print, unfortunately, but the book is called Warrigal's Way. So this is an excellent opportunity to remember the work of the Black writers from that prize. There has been actually a concerted effort to republish many of those pieces, and if anyone is around in Melbourne next Wednesday evening, I believe, and would like to come to an event held in this very room, we'll actually be looking at a new series which is being published by University of Queensland Press, which is reviving some of those out-of-print winners of the David Yeena Prize. Janine Lane, who will be reading at that event, is also a part of this series. So this is from Mum and Me by Warrigal Anderson. I don't remember my old man. I was much too young, but Mum told me about him one night when she was down in her cups and drinking wine. He was her second husband. Her first husband and my half-brother died in 1930, something of measles. Mum said the old man was a top bloke, but the war turned him strange and he did dreadful things, like bashing her something terrible and scarring her for life with his stock whip, breaking bones and kicking her for such crimes as not going to bed with one of his drunken mates when he was feeling generous, or serving up his tea cold when he came home from the pub at some ungodly hour, and other petty things, like breaking my brother Gordon's nose and cheekbones when he ran to the door and was greeted by a casual backhander, just like you wouldn't swat a fly. It didn't stop there. Mum said he tried to rape Pauline, my older sister, when she was about 9. That was the last straw for Mum. You'd have to be Aboriginal in my age to understand how hard it was for my mother with 3 young kids, me, a babe in arms, to walk out and try to make a life of her own, to raise us, particularly in the days when you were considered less than a white man's dog. At least they had to be registered. For what I've been told, we shifted into a shack on the outskirts of Swan Hill. That's where Pauline was taken from. I was too young to remember her, so we've never met. So if you're about 60, have green eyes and remember being called Kylie as a child, get in touch, sister. Among my early memories is a policeman and a big bloke in a black suit taking Gordon away in a black car. Mum said the black suit was from the department and that he had a warrant. I don't know what the department was or a warrant, but that big bloke in the suit put the fear of God into me for years. I've no idea why they didn't take me. Maybe I was too young or they didn't know about me. Anyway, Mum and I took off. We played hide and seek in that department all over the place, endless towns, staying 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes Mum got work in a pub and I would have to hide in a room. We even camped at a big dry water tank for a week before we went back to Swan Hill. Mum got a job picking grapes, but the old man found us and gave her a belting until the local people bashed him and she got away. You know, for the life of me, I can't remember it, although Mum says I was there. We went to Melbourne from there. I was about to turn 10. Mum wasn't sure of the date, but this was the year, early March 48. March, that's your birthday, love. Don't know the day. We had no calendar on the road that year. 1958, yeah, you'd be 10 this March. So with no trumpets or drums, my birthday came and went. They were living in the shed at the backyard of Cobby and Marge's place, friends of Mum's. Mum was making really good money and killing herself working 2 jobs. The city was full up for some reason and there was plenty of work about. We went back to rooms after Mum had a row with Cobby, as he wanted to put the rent up on the shed. So I spent the next 9 months hiding in rooms, flats, friendly houses. I was rarely allowed out to play and we were always ready to flee in an instant. Mum was usually doing work in a pub, housemaiding or done washing. I was at home, pretty young and dumb. I'd never gone to school. Being classed as a government ward with an arrest warrant on me, it wasn't a good idea to go wandering about if I wanted to stay out of a welfare home. Just like a jail, love, with locks and bars on the windows and iron doors. That's where they got Pauline and Gordon, the department welfare home. The department, Mum called them. I didn't know just what a department was, but I knew it was big and the people wore black suits and hung around with police. Any big bloke in a black suit could trigger fear in me because of the one who took away Gordon. Even to this day, I'm uncomfortable around authority. It was an interesting thing, actually, and I have the opportunity, I guess, kind of being an intermediary between the original sort of piece and Nayuka's reading of this by virtue of me kind of standing here tonight. The way that we've approached this archival series has been, I think, a little bit organic. Some people have wanted to sit with the physical copies, some people have wanted to just sit on the Google Drive and search keywords, and some people have just kind of already come to us and said, actually, no, I remember, it was a copy of Overland, it was published in this year, I've got it on my shelf, I've got post-its on it, and I know exactly who it is and what it is, and I've always wanted to do this, thank you for letting me do this. This is one of the few kind of moments where in the process of building up this series we've approached a writer and we said, this is what I want you to talk about. Nayuka is a Gunditjmara, Gunai Wiradjuri Yorta writer and particularly a comedy writer and works a lot in TV. I told Nayuka the story of reading aloud a section from this short story at the Stephen Murray Smith lecture at the State Library last year. And I'm not entirely sure if perhaps someone in the audience misheard me, but when I read out a section of this, someone in the audience laughed. And I don't think you've got to be a blackfella to realise that this is not a funny story. So in the process of discussing Nayuka's contribution, they returned a lot to this idea of laughter and comedy, and the essay thus far is called Reading the Room, which I think is quite fitting, not just for the piece and the nature in which this piece was distributed, but the way in which, for the first time in, I suspect, many, many years, given that, you know, this is an edition that's been sitting in a box undigitised for a long time. I'm not sure if it's been read in a while, and when it was read aloud, it received, I think, probably the worst possible reaction that you can have as a blackfella writing about this kind of history. So I'm really excited that Nay has been working with this particular story, and I think the capacity of this series and the work of this series to give dignity to those pieces is something that I just would love to emphasise while I've got the opportunity, because Nay wouldn't. Nay's a bit more humble than that, so. This is called Reading the Room, a response to Warrigal Anderson. And here's the silly little thing, naive as it might be. I do think that art can be appreciated by anyone. I think our experiences of art, and by extension the artist, have something to tell us about what it means to be human, and that actually none of this requires a narrow sameness. It requires humanity, and we are not all human. I don't need to be from Derry to get a laugh out of Derry girls and to know the struggle of existing in occupied territory while trying to squeeze the most out of life as a teenager. I don't need to be a middle-aged white man to cry at a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert, although I will insist that Flea is a blackfella and that Under the Bridge is a song about country. Art can transcend the precise coordinates of our identities and situate us among other fans whose political, social, economic, gender, sexual allegiances we will never and won't need to know, because right at that moment we are both humans experiencing the sublime. What a wonderful thing. What an utterly alive moment to share with someone we will never meet again. I don't remember how I first came to Hanif Akurabi's writing, but I do know that it was something he'd written about Carly Rae Jepsen that lured me in. An email receipt tells me I first bought his book of essays, They Can't Till Us Till They Kill Us, in late October 2018. I am, unashamedly, a devotee of his writing. I've just finished A Little Devil in America, and like so much of his other writing before this, I've been cracked open emotionally and intellectually. I will not take this space to fawn more than I already have, but there are reasons I'm bringing him up now. You know what's funny? Since I started writing this, I mean right now, in this very moment, the last 700 words, I've had Kendrick Lamar's Black of the Berry quietly circling in my head. Not intentionally, but in the way a song pops in your head inadvertently. It refuses to relent. I can't recall the lyrics, but there is a guttural, almost barking sound, more discreet than DMX, less playful than early Snoop Doggy Dogg. The not quite bark reminds me I was in a crowd at Byron Bay Blues Festival in 2016, the very same blues festival that programmed then deprogrammed Sticky Fingers this year. Kendrick Lamar toured Australia with his 2015 album To Pimp a Butterfly. I counted and do still count myself so lucky to have been able to see him perform this live. There is much to be said about the live production itself, but what I do remember is that the crowd is how embarrassed I was to be in that crowd. At one point, someone had scaled scaffolding and Kendrick stopped to beckon the person down. The crowd were aggressive and a fight broke out. That all sucked, but the tipping point for me was the crowd singing and rapping along to the N-word during his set. This was not the first, nor the last time I've witnessed this. A pale, dimpled ocean of white men screaming this slur like their lives depend on it, and it doesn't mean a single thing simultaneously. What ungrateful racist sacks of shit. It isn't enough that it costs a small fortune to travel approximately 300 light years away from your home, and it is not only you but your crew, and it isn't enough that the Australian market is a blip to the wallet unless you're pink, and it isn't enough to be among the best in the world at your chosen craft. You must then be subject to white edgelords with cum-encrusted socks scream racist slurs at you off-key. Like I said, I was embarrassed. And that's where I'm ending it, actually, because I think that's the most appropriate way. So apologies that Nayuka couldn't be here, but please clap for them. Hopefully they will hear it at home. So can I please ask our lovely panel guests to come and join me up here, and John too. So we have a pretty exciting little discussion. We're going to be hearing from Jeff Sparrow, who is a writer, editor and academic. He works at the Centre for Advancing Journalism and writes a regular column for Guardian Australia. His most recent book is Provocations, New and Selected Writing, which is New South in 2022. You've always got a newer book coming out, though. Have you got another one since then, or you're working on another one? We'll get to that, I'm sure. Yeah, he writes very quickly. And we'll also be hearing from Sam Ryan. Sam's a PhD candidate at UTAS, conducting a comprehensive study of the poetry in Overland and Quadrant. He's written for the Journal of Australian History and Biography and the Australian Book Review. So, and then there's just us, but we have to be here. So both Jeff and Sam are here in interesting relationships to Overland. The paratext to their bios is that Jeff is a former editor of Overland, as many of you, and I'm pretty sure like everyone in the room already knows. And Sam is also Overland's archivist and has been digitising the 69 years of Overland's print history as part of this project. Arduously, painstakingly, covered in paper, yeah, dust, so much dust. We'll get to the dust in a moment. But Jeff is also actually in our 250th edition. So to start off, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of background on this essay, which is in this edition, particularly around your discussion of elite capture and how this is currently operating in the higher education context.
Sure, I'd be Glad to. So this was something that I was thinking about after starting work at the University of Melbourne and being at an event where some very senior management figures were doing an acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to think when at an event like this, people do an acknowledgement of country and say something like sovereignty was never ceded. That is some kind of exhortation to action, a call to justice and to redress of historic wrongs. But I was at this event, I was thinking, what does it actually mean when somebody who's in charge of an institution like the University of Melbourne says that sovereignty was never ceded? I think I calculated, I forget exactly what the figure is, but in the article I think I say the University of Melbourne owns $2.8 billion worth of property. So if you think that sovereignty was never ceded, why don't you give it back? So what does it mean to use this rhetoric in a context where there is nothing arising from it? And I was thinking about that in terms of Olufemi Otaiwo's book, Elite Capture, which I'm sure some people here have read, which is accounts of how tropes, ideas and discourses that once associated with the radical left have become associated with people in positions of power. And he gives a whole series of examples of this, and I've actually got one set up. If you could play the YouTube clip, this is one example that he gives from this book, which I think perfectly sort of sums up the notion of elite capture.
I quoted Zora Neale Hurston's "How It Feels to Be Colored Me" in my college application essay. The line that spoke to me stated simply, "I am not tragically colored. There is no sorrow dammed up in my soul nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all." At 17, I had no idea what life would bring, but Zora's sentiment articulated so beautifully how I felt as a daughter of immigrants then and now. Nothing about me was or is tragic. I am perfectly made. I can wax eloquent on complex legal issues in English while also belting Guayaquil de mis amores in Spanish. I can change a diaper with one hand and console a crying toddler with the other. I am a woman of color. I am a mom. I am a cisgender millennial who's been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I am intersectional, but my existence is not a box-checking exercise. I am a walking declaration, a woman whose inflection does not rise at the end of her sentences, suggesting that a question has been asked. I did not sneak into CIA. My employment was not and is not the result of a fluke or slip through the cracks. I earned my way in, and I earned my way up the ranks of this organization. I am educated, qualified, and competent, and sometimes I struggle. I struggle feeling like I could do more, be more to my two sons, and I struggle leaving the office when I feel there's so much more to do. I used to struggle with imposter syndrome, but at 36, I refuse to internalize misguided patriarchal ideas of what a woman can or should be. I am tired of feeling like I'm supposed to apologize for the space I occupy rather than intoxicate people with my effort, my brilliance. I am proud of me, full stop. My parents left everything they knew and loved to expose me to opportunities they never had. Because of them, I stand here today a proud first.
I think once they mentioned that one's off. Once they mentioned the CIA, the first time, I think you've really got the irony that Jeff is trying to draw.
But you can see what I mean. So this is an example he uses of elite capture. This is an ad for, it's a recruitment ad for the CIA, which is entirely pitched using kind of tropes of campus identity politics. And this is the sort of idea that I'm trying to get out in this piece. What does it mean when an organisation like the CIA can use all of those tropes to recruit people to join the CIA? So that's what the piece is about.
It means brown women in America and here are being really screwed over. That's what it means.
May I borrow that one? I think mine's off.
Another man.
Oh, it's good now? You can all hear me? Oh. I should work for the CIA. Okay, just, and some of this is for the sake of provocation, but the more youthful, on the Twitter, less serious version of this happened, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. There was this advocate, very much a small bean of the internet, interesting, a non-binary figure who it turned out was like a high-powered weapons specialist for Lockheed Martin, etc. And okay, just for the sake of provocation, is there anything inherent rhetorically to the slipperiness of these forms, this way of thinking about leftist positions that makes it amenable to this sort of thing, or are we just talking about capitalism's seamless occupation of the horizons of the thinkable Mark Fisher sort of thing?
Yeah, actually, my favourite was I think this year the FBI was celebrating Martin Luther King Day. But yeah, right. So I think that there's two obvious responses to this, isn't there? There's one response which is to say, okay, we might feel a little bit squeamish about this stuff, but what it actually represents is people in power being forced to recognise the strength of our movement and having to take on these concerns. And so, by and large, it might be a little bit icky, but it's probably...
The generous reading.
Yeah, it's probably a good thing. The argument that I try to make in this piece is that when the University of Melbourne, which is where I work, is doing this, they're doing it as a management strategy. It's a way of asserting the prerogatives, the traditional prerogatives of management and controlling their workforce. And the short version of this, I think, is that it's about establishing a theory of agency. So who is responsible for social change in the world? So traditionally, the left would have said, when it comes to fighting for Indigenous rights, this is a fight that happens from the bottom of society. This is a fight that ordinary people have historically and traditionally led, and, these are the source of agency. Once people in a position of management say, actually, we are the people who are responsible for fighting for Indigenous rights, which is what they are doing with this rhetoric. What this allows them to do is to say that if you, the ordinary staff and students of the university, start to organise yourselves, you are disrupting us, the management. We are the people who are capable of fighting for social justice. And so by you organising yourself in a union or as students, what you're actually doing is standing in the way of social justice. And that's the way that the logic works. And so what it means is you can simultaneously use this rhetoric and say that, for instance, staff trying to organise for a better enterprise bargain is a bad thing. And that, the argument in the piece is a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic.
Well, that's why they're reading the piece, isn't it? That's why we're making sure everybody...
Subscribe, buy the edition.
Subscribe or buy the issue.
Like and subscribe, please.
This is not a piece that you wrote specifically to commemorate 250 editions by any means, but it, I think, is an interesting point of eventfulness, thinking of, Overland's legacy in history and the way in which the journal has pivoted towards new struggles on the left, or rather old reoccurring movements and currents on the left. And so, your involvement in the 250th edition is also kind of coinciding with us roping you into this archive project. So my pivot here, expert pivot here, is asking you if you're, your own kinds of points of reflection or connection regarding the way in which, particularly in the left, we occasionally have this problem of the constant reinvention of history and the constant reinvention of new solutions for old struggles, and that's been that's a part of a logic of why we've wanted this digitisation project, to ensure that there is actually a tangible, engageable record of issues. Obviously we didn't have the term elite capture in such an explicit sense, but these are still issues that you were publishing editions on, in 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And so I suppose, that's a prompt to ask you to reflect on the nature of a continuing sort of function of a publication like Overland and the digitisation of this archival, this memory, this reaching back into what we've already said about these issues before and why it perhaps doesn't resonate because it's been said in the past. I don't know, that's a really long way of saying just talk to me.
No. Look, I think this is tremendously important. I think the archival work that you guys are doing is really significant because I think it matters a great deal for the left to have a thick history, right? Like to have a series of heroes and villains, of having material that we can look back at and use as points of reference. And one of the real weaknesses of the left, I think, is that we don't necessarily have that. I mean, if you look back on the early history of Overland, there's a lot wrong with it. You know, I mean...
Like what?
Sam's going to tell us about that.
So,
He's got a list.
You know, like in some respects, I think that both politically and aesthetically, like a lot of the decisions that they made were not necessarily good ones. But that being said, having those decisions, right or wrong, as points of reference are really important. So you think back to the early Overland project and the idea of, say, social realism as a way of engaging with political literature, and the idea that what literature should do is come up with representations of positive heroes that will simultaneously reflect and inspire oppressed communities to affect social change. When you put it like that, that is not so it's not so different from what many people take as a common sense position in terms of engaging with culture. The idea of representation matters. And so I think there are clearly things to be learned from that history, that other people have tried to engage with questions that people are engaging with now, and rightly or wrongly they have done things, and we can learn from that. And one of the things that I think the early editors of Overland did really well, and the early editors of Meanjin, was create a kind of self-mythology. You know, like that the early figures like, you know, Clem Christensen in Meanjin, Ian Turner and Stephen Murray Smith in Overland are written about and engaged with in a way that I think becomes a sort of point of reference for people looking back. You can say, you know, they did this, they did that, this was right, this was wrong. And I think that's really, really important. And the idea that that I'm sure a lot of people here have, that if you're on the left, you can do things, you can write things, and it just all disappears into the void. It's so destructive, and it, you know, like overcoming that with an archival project seems to be tremendously important.
Yeah, like, I agree with all of that.
Quote that on the next grant application.
I'm just wondering if, we can bottle that and put that in an acquittal or something like that. Sam, so this is your research, and the interesting thing is we didn't knock on your door. This was research that you found, and you came into a pathway. You chose this. And I'd like you to tell us about why and what drew you to that and what your project is more broadly.
Sure. So it's a comparative study of the poetry in Overland and Quadrant. Anyone who knows the history of Quadrant knows why that's interesting. I didn't start at Overland, of course. I actually started with Quadrant. A friend...
Don't say of course, that has implications.
No, because I'll explain.
Sam's a
fascist. Because of my fascism. No, I've got a friend, a poet who I no longer talk to. We were getting pissed at Lounge, if you recall, and he was shit talking Overland, and he something like, you know, the history with the realist writer and the links to the Soviets through the CPA, and I said, well, you know, who cares? Who gives a shit? What did the USSR ever do wrong? And he said, well, you know, the Quadrant was founded by the spooks. He's also a racist, which is why I don't talk to him anymore. And I said, why do you, what do you mean spooks? It's the CIA. I thought that was fascinating. So I started looking at quadrant.
It amazes me that that's still not more widely known in the general reading population, by the way. But
Quadrant declined our
CIA
invitation this evening, by the way.
Please carry on.
Quadrant declines many of my invitations for obvious reasons. Yeah, so then I started looking at Quadrant and Overland and kind of landed on the period of 75 to 85. I've since shortened it to 75 to 80 because there's 150 issues of Quadrant published in that decade and 40 of Overland. But I started looking at it and I noticed that you had the same poets for the most part who were published across the two. And I thought that's a very, very strange thing. You have Overland with its associations with the CPA, and then you have Quadrant with the being fash. It shouldn't happen, and you can explain it easily by saying poets, contrary to popular opinion, are just like the rest of us, and do need money. So they will publish wherever. But I don't think that's good enough. I think when we look at the literary journal as a form, it's best to understand it as what you might call, say, a tertiary genre. So a simple genre like a statement, question, whatever, a complex genre or a primary and secondary genre like poetry and prose and what have you, and then a tertiary genre where you have this singular form that I don't think we should understand as a simple container of literature. Rather, the editors, like yourselves, come in and act as authors through selection, curation, and what we might call habitus, in the way that kind of you deal with writers and publishers and printers and work within the literary field. And once we understand it as a tertiary genre, we're able to see how the meaning of a poem can be transformed by the text that it appears alongside. My favourite anecdote on this is that Judith Wright, that famous lefty, appeared in the first issue of Quadrant. So yeah, basically where you take Judith Wright or a similar poet's cultural capital, and then you attach it to this kind of reactionary nonsense. And I encourage you, jump on Quadrant. $50 for a year. You can. I've done this, or you can email me and I'll send you all the copies.
It's being recorded, isn't it?
And I know, and I'll send you all the copies for free. Go back.
Jeff is very confused.
Go back through the archives and of Quadrant and Overland, but with Quadrant, you can see how insane it is. How absolutely nutso these people were. They're pretty nuts now, but they
Okay, so you think they were nuts, more nuts then? Because this is a sort of contra the narrative, the Robert Mann narrative that Quadrant...
Yeah.
Because Quadrant is pretty nuts now, and I thought in general, in certain respects anyway, it was less...
Like the lead poisoning is compounded.
At some point in the past, that's the folly of youth.
I think it's a different beast now. They're like, they have like the Trumpian brain disease, whatever it is that conservatives have, where they
have some sort of QAnon style.
They're pretty close
online these days. Yeah.
Pretty close, and it's fun to jump on there. But if you go back in the archive, sorry, I'll finish. And I'm aware I've been ranting for about 4 minutes. There's an editorial by dear James Macaulay discussing basically how women are predisposed not to be good at writing. Because of I don't know what he says. It's like chromosomes or something. It's insane. And then later, there's so much stuff. There's one point where they call Noam Chomsky a Nazi, and then he writes in reply to that, which is just like, and then if anyone knows,
time on his hands.
if anyone knows who Dinesh D'Souza is, yeah, so he was published in that early quadrant. Bob Santamaria, everyone's favourite Catholic, published an essay on the immorality of IVF. You know, like it was.
Okay, but you made a very persuasive case.
Yeah, it was this foundational level of right-wing insanity, which, if you're into it, is just beautiful to read.
But I was just going to say, though, I mean, it is also the old quadrant is different from new quadrant in that James Macaulay was like an apocalyptic Catholic, right? So there's this whole sort of sense that communism is the manifestation of the Antichrist. Yes. And so, you know, Macaulay had been around the Communist Party, had been on the left and had a religious conversion, swung over to Catholicism and had this sort of apocalyptic kind of strain. But of course, the CIA, when it was funding literary magazines, did not want to fund right-wing magazines. It wanted to fund left-wing anti-communist magazines, and their big concern was that Quadrant was too right-wing. So, like, elsewhere, they were funding kind of, you know, anti-communist modernism. In Australia, the sort of peculiarity of it is that both Quadrant and Overland are anti-modernist. Surely that's one of the reasons why some of the poets are appearing in both of them, yeah? There's this sort of a similar kind of aesthetic happening between the two magazines.
I would say the anti-modernism of either, you know, by the 70s had gone away. So Macaulay died 76, Vivian Smith took over as poetry editor, and he was quite. And I also think Macaulay softened in his approach to modernist poetry as he got older. But then I also think that I don't know that Overland was ever too opposed to modernism. You know, Barry Reed was the poetry editor, and he published plenty of quite, like, I mean, I don't like saying modernism, because what is modernism? And modernism in Australia, you know, for various reasons, because of James Macaulay and Malley, etc., means a much different thing. But Overland certainly published what we could call modernist poetry, at least after the 60s, 65 kind of thing.
I've completely lost control of this. I would, one of the things that Sam did kind of like prepare for this, because we did sort of thrust this upon Sam, is you picked out some of your favourite anecdotes or bizarre things from the archive when you were in the process of digitising. And Jeff, we'd be curious as to any of your thoughts on any of this as well, if you've also got some strange things in the archive. But you were showing me just before that I found to be quite a compelling...
Yeah. What's something bizarre that really sticks out?
Yeah, sure. Issue 62, the 21st anniversary issue, which you can have a look at the back or online. The front cover is this beautiful little Michael Leunig cartoon, and it was, I guess, Leunig before he went beast mode, or whatever he's up to these days. Yeah. But it's this lovely little kind of Leunig-esque character digging the earth out from under him. And it's, you know, obviously like an anti-mining environmentalist kind of cartoon. Flip over the magazine, and on the back cover, you'll find an ad for Comalco and for Rio Tinto, which is, you know, quite a clash. Obviously, you know, for obvious reasons. So you see those ads throughout the late 60s, most of the 70s, I think up until 81, those Comalco and those Rio Tinto ads, until in the December issue of 81, I think it was 92, issue number 92. Murray Smith writes an editorial which is in reply to the head of the Australia Council at the time, who I think was some kind of Liberal Party shill, or like an advisor or an ex-politician or something, who had suggested that any journal that takes money from private advertisers should be means tested, so their funding should be decreased by that, which, you know, maybe we agree with now, perhaps, but not so much back then. And so he wrote a letter, or replied in swag, refuting that, and he said, and by the way, about these Comalco ads, right at the end, we have them because we need the money. Because we have to run a business and we're not in the pocket of Comalco. And like, it quite a good defence, I think. Perhaps, you know, I don't know, but a good defence. But then interestingly, after 81 in December, those ads disappear, completely disappear. Now, I've got some thoughts on Overland's links to Comalco and Rio Tinto. In those days, I do.
And so we thought we'd extend the panel and just go to it.
Yeah, so
and we'd also like Jeff's comments on...
Ken Gott was a advisor
At least
for
we didn't
Comalco.
get money from the CIA.
What do you think of Lockheed Martin? But this was, I guess the kind of, you know, because we're wrapping up relatively soon, but the kind of reflective comments on that, I suppose. I mean, this was an inheritance of yours as much as it was of ours as well. You claimed
this.
no.
It's nothing to do with me.
I think he was a little bit later in the day.
No, I don't think you were editing Overland in 1981. No, I suppose I'm curious. I think, you know, like, it's certainly an Aboriginal cultural value that you take responsibility for the past, but I think in the left that doesn't always translate in the way that we think about. And this is the clash, right? This is the tension of how do we account for the histories of clear, that what Sam's outlining here, of clear, you know, bad choices and bad alliances, and the kind of the necessity of moving on to better decisions, but also of acknowledging, remembering, and learning from the past. I suppose, you know, that was in your tenure of the way that you were thinking about the left and thinking about the role of a journal like Overland into the future and into modernising certain mechanisms of it.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, you were talking before about the Temper Democratic Bias Australian, the Joseph Furphy slogan. I mean, Joseph Furphy was a fervent defender of white Australia. And if you think about that slogan now, it sounds like a Hans Knight slogan, doesn't it? You know? Yeah. Temper Democratic Bias Australian. I mean, who says that?
There's a reason we didn't put that on the shirts.
Yeah.
A few of them. Yeah.
So... I think you're right. I think that, you know, part of having that thick history that I'm talking about before is recognising the wrong turns and the mistakes. I mean, for me, a lot of it goes back to the Communist Party and the trajectory of the Communist Party. You know, the left's relationship to Stalinism and what that meant, both as a political, but also as an aesthetic theory. So the social realism that Overland embraced was a Stalinist orthodoxy that came, you know, out of the 1930s. So it's a terrible theory and it had terrible aesthetic consequences, but there were people that did some amazing things within the constraints of social thrill. I mean, I happen to think John Morrison, for instance, who was someone very much associated with Overland, is one of the greatest short story writers that the country has ever produced. And his books about the waterfront are just amazing. If you ever get the chance to read them, they're just astonishing. And one of the things, for instance, that social realism did was create an audience for working class writing, create an infrastructure that blue collar people without very much education could see themselves both as readers and writers. So it's a contradictory history, and I think that's okay to recognise that it's a contradictory history. We don't have to sort of whitewash the past, but there are good things we can take away from it as well as bad things.
I agree, and I think someone was about to clap at that, which I think meant that they also agree. One of the things that we promised we weren't going to do to you guys in this panel is turn it into an Overland quiz, but we actually changed our mind. So we have a quiz for you both. So we're curious about who's going to win, a former editor of Overland and the archivist of Overland's digital editions. So
I did not approve this.
No, he didn't. I live in anarchy. So to kind of, you know, to round us out, we have a quiz for you, and whoever wins gets a tote bag, and a free copy of an edition or several, I don't know. All right, so first question. What is, and this is multiple choice, what is the Overland Meanjin trophy made out of?
Emu.
No, Jeff, you've misunderstood what
because it's
multiple
down
choice
there.
means.
It's down there in the
A
cabinet.
carved emu egg is one of the options. So is a meat tray, a cricket bat, a commemorative statue of Ned Kelly's helmet, or a long neck of VB. What is your answer?
The emu eggs down
Yeah, the thing that's down there.
All right.
Check it out, though, everybody. It's pretty cool.
We've got
It's a great
one
egg.
even. How many subscriptions have we received this year from confused off-road enthusiasts who think that we review four-wheel drives?
I tell you what, if you ever see Overland, the other Overland magazine, they have the best T-shirt.
They do. They also sell commemorative knives, and we have tried to get some of them, but they won't send them to us.
So I tried
is
to
that-
organise a 2-for-1 deal with them at one stage.
We
but
did.
They
They collaborated with us for our last subscriber drive. One of the prizes was a subscription to the four-wheel drive Overland.
I am terribly embarrassed. I think I'm in the wrong place.
Yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry. Do you guys want to guess the number of how many we got this year? It's only 2023. How many do you think we got?
5.
All right, that's your locking that in?
I think 20.
No, okay. All right, you both think everyone else is dumber than they are. We only got one this year.
Oh, okay.
So far. Okay.
It's good that we were both wrong.
Yeah. All right. What classic Australian icon has appeared on the most Overland covers? And bonus points if you can guess how many covers feature this image, all right? So, first off, a gun. Christos Chalkis. Full body nudity. Or Ned Kelly's helmet. So you got to answer which ones appeared on the most and how many if you can guess.
I'm going to go for Christos.
You reckon Christos has appeared on the most? Well, that's because under your tenure, you did put several
There
photos
were a
of
few
him
of those, Jeff. Yeah.
on Overland
What can I
covers.
say?
Kept coming back.
Christos shifts units.
All right, so we've got Jeff locked in for Christos. What do
It's obviously Ned Kelly.
you think
Like,
it's Ned Kelly?
For sure. And
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got, so Murray Smith would have done it at least 4 times. McLaren couldn't resist doing it at least once. Sison would have done it ironically. Nathan Hollier wouldn't have done it. You didn't do it. And there's no way Jacinda would have done it. And you
No.
guys haven't done it yet.
Not yet,
Not
but
as
that's
yet.
the next one.
But you might do it ironically as well.
Yeah,
that'd
so
be- So it's
you
like
reckon,
6.
You reckon Ned Kelly and you reckon Christos Chalkis. All right, you're both wrong. It's actually full body nudity. Yeah, there's more, you know, full body nudity.
How many
on.
issues?
Sure,
And
we're
tell me
so
which
it
ones
depends
are
on
they?
how
Sure,
you
we're talking about
define
the
it.
same magazine.
So it depends on how you define full body nudity, whether it's from the back or the front. But we did a survey and we think it's probably 9. We think probably. That's where
We
we're
didn't
at.
do full body nudity when I was editing it. So I don't know what
Unfortunately,
you
Jeff,
guys-
I have to say there was at least partial under your tenure.
I'm
So,
gonna say.
all right, we've
It's
already
not a
received the
skin
answer for
magazine.
this one, so this one isn't fun. What was Overland's founding motto? Temper democratic, bias Australian. Temper Australian, bias democratic. Democratically biased, Australian tempered. Or get on the beers.
Get on the beers.
Yeah, I can
More
get
or
on
less
the
the
beers.
unofficial one.
Yeah, let's change
All right.
it.
Okay. I believe it has been dropped recently, but we'll definitely put get on the beers back.
It was
And
definitely John McLaren and Ian Sison's
yeah,
motto.
yeah, you're not claiming that one. And the final question is, what is the name of our ASIO officer?
Sam Ryan.
Great. All right. Thanks for the information. Thank you all for a lovely evening. We just wanted to know
Thank
that
you
that
both
wasn't
so
a
much.
quiz.
And we apologise deeply for that masturbatory exercise. Actually,
I
very
don't.
funny. It's
I
very
make
funny.
absolutely
Yes,
no
yeah, yeah.
apologies.
I could have sworn it'd be Ned Kelly too, actually. But yeah,
No,
there you
I
go,
also
yeah.
thought so. That's why I wrote the quiz. I really thought it was going to be Ned Kelly, but I genuinely, there was more nudity.
Why not both?
Well,
There's a question. It's all about the armour.
so look forward to the cover of our 251st edition, in short. But thank you both so much for joining us.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all
so
for
much.
coming, and thank you again, City of Melbourne, the Wheeler Centre. And please, you know, we've got the space for a little bit longer. Please
Have a
enjoy.
drink.
And please check out Overland's digitised archive online and look forward to the new contributions to the essay series in coming months. We're very excited that we'll be featuring writers like Janine Lane, Jeff Sparrow, Sam Ryan, Nayuka Gorrie, and many more. So thank you so much. And yeah, have a great night.
Thank you all.